Well, that was a much nicer welcome than I got in 1967 when I got off the ship in Fremantle and came here to visit the Department of Agricultural Economics, which consisted, I think, of Henry Schapper, and also visiting at the time was I have these problems about names these days. Anyway, Henry gave me a pretty hard time, and I thought, if all the agricultural economists in Australia are like that, I'm getting on the ship and going home. But Arthur Rickards was also here. He was visiting from the University of New England, and he was a fairly abrasive character in those days too. So I had a rough time, and I obviously I found that it was better than that, and I'm still here. So thanks for coming, and I'm going to talk about coping with risk in agriculture. About that time, there was a cowboy movie starring Clint Eastwood called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And it was being shown in the cinemas around that time I was here. It was made in 1966, I think in Italy. It became something of a cult movie. I think it was pretty bad. I don't know I ever saw it. But the title sort of came into the English language. Meaning some things were good, some things were bad, and some things were not as they should be or could be. And that's what this seminar is about in relation to risk. What's good, what's bad, and what's pretty ugly about the way risk is coped with in various parts of the world. But about that time too, my then boss, the late John Dillon, set an exam question which caused a bit of a stir. So I thought I would start by giving you the exam question, and when you get bored, you can think about what the right answer is. The movie ended with a shootout in a graveyard, I believe, and this is the graveyard shootout. There were 3 cowboys, and you're the good guy, right? And there's the bad guy and the ugly guy, and you're going to take turns at shooting. And I'm afraid you're not a very good shot. You've only got 1 chance in 3 of hitting your target. Okay? The bad guy's twice as good. He's got 2 chances in 3 of hitting the target. And the ugly guy, unfortunately, is a crack shot. He kills whoever he aims at. Now, the way it works is this, that you're going to shoot in order. You're in this order. You're first, then the bad guy, then the ugly guy. And the question is, everyone knows the probabilities. What should you do? Now, if you know the answer, or you think you know the answer, don't shout it out. We'll come back to the problem at the end. So that's a risky choice. There's uncertainty as far as you're concerned, and you're not indifferent between the consequences, the possible consequences, being dead or being alive, right? So it's quite a serious, risky problem, and you might want to think about how you would resolve that. So, some things about risk. The first thing that should show you, maybe, is that risk isn't easy. It's quite tricky dealing with risk. One reason why it's tricky is that risk is something that hasn't happened yet. It's something in the future. So it's entirely imaginary. If it hasn't happened, it's wholly imaginary. It's not something to do with historical variance. It's something in the future that hasn't yet happened. And I wasn't the first one to say that. Kenneth Arrow said that, and he got the Nobel Prize for his work on risk. So perhaps it's true. It might not be true, as we might discuss later. And failures in risk management, risk analysis and management, are really failures in thinking, cognitive failures, not thinking clearly or not thinking at all. The outcomes of risky decisions necessarily depend partly on luck. You can't always get it right. You might get shot in the shootout. And by the nature of risk, even good decisions might turn out badly. Yet CEOs of corporations get fired for being unlucky. They may have made good decisions, and you find that in many organisations, middle-level managers particularly, tend to be extremely risk-averse, not because that's good for the company, but because they don't want to get fired. it's a principal-agent problem. The other thing is, I don't like the way risk in many situations is treated as if it's or is regarded as a disease that has to be treated. It's just part of the human condition. There's risk everywhere, all the time. Almost every decision has some risk. And economics teaches us that profit is the reward for risk-taking, so no risk, no gain, no pain, no gain. You know, you have to take risks if you want to make a profit. It'd also be pretty dull if there was no risk. But there are some risks, like being shot at, that the consequences can be rather bad. And for those are the ones we need to worry about, right? We need to think about trying to get those, trying to analyse those risks rather thoughtfully and carefully. And in the risk, sort of risk discipline, very often non-quantitative methods are used. So if I said to you, there's a risk in this particular situation that's moderately likely and rather serious, I mean, what does that convey to you? Having non-quantitative treatment of risk seems to me to be capable of causing a lot of imprecision and confusion. And I like to think we can put numbers on some of these things. Also, typically in the risk discipline, risks are considered one by one, but bad things don't always happen one at a time. They tend to happen in strings or at the same time. So it's best to consider risk in a portfolio setting. And stochastic dependency, if you like, correlation, matters. Most obviously, benefits of diversification. If things aren't perfectly correlated, if they are highly correlated, then obviously you've got more risk. There's one of the current fads in agricultural economics, as you probably know, is promoting the idea of crop or income insurance for farmers all around the world. The main reason for that, by the way, is that subsidising crop insurance fits into the green box in the WTO rules. So you can't now directly subsidise farmers, that's not supposed to, but you can have highly subsidised crop insurance. The US crop insurance system, I'm not up to date, but when I last looked at it, the indemnity payments per dollar of premium were about $6. So the farmers got back about 6 times what they paid. That's the sort of insurance I'd like to buy. Some farmers got $12 back. One way they did that was by growing inappropriate crops with high variability and a fairly high chance of failure. So US agriculture is becoming increasingly inefficient because of their corrupt crop insurance scheme. The politicians got their hands on it. A mate of mine, Jerry Skeese, designed it originally, and it was fine, but the pollies have got into the game and stuffed it up. And they tend to do that in many countries. In Mexico, the indemnity payments and the crop insurance go in cycles in tune with the election cycle. So just before an election, the farmers get a lot more. So I'm not a great fan, you might tell, of subsidised crop insurance. And practice of the way risk is handled in many situations often overlooks some of the ugly things we know to avoid in coping with risk, and I'll talk about that some more. Well, rationalising risky choice, how do you do it? Well, the first person to suggest a method was a guy called Daniel Bernoulli, who was one of the Bernoulli family. I think they were really Swiss, or they sound Italian. They were all polymaths, and they were a very bright group of people. And that's him. He's got pretty hairdo, hasn't he? And he put this idea forward a while back in 1738. Now, Daniel wrote in Latin, as all educated people did in those days, and it was largely ignored by economists who apparently couldn't understand Latin, for the most part, until John von Neumann, a very famous mathematician, and Oscar Morgenstern, who worked in management, reinvented the approach just in that period at the end of the war. There'd been a lot of research during the war into risky decision-making, as you might imagine, And they invented it and provided an axiomatic foundation for the theory. And the theory implies that in a risky decision, you should act consistently with what you believe about the future uncertainty and with what you prefer, your relative preferences for the available consequences, whether those are good or bad. And I'll call this approach the subjective expected utility hypothesis, or it's also called the Newlian decision theory. And in applying this hypothesis to risky choices, beliefs about the future uncertainty are described with personal or subjective probabilities, and preferences are described with a personal utility function for the consequences. And choice is optimized by maximizing the subjective probability weighted average of the utilities of the consequences, maximizing subjective expected utility. And a hero of mine is Jimmy Savage, who wrote a book about that back in 1954. Well, is subjective expected utility sound? I claim it's logical as a prescriptive theory of choice, of what you should do. Consider the contrary. The contrary hypothesis is you shouldn't act consistently with what you prefer and believe, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So obviously, if you think, it seems to me completely logical to say in a risky world you should behave consistently. You should choose consistently with your beliefs and preferences. But do people generally do that? Well, no, they don't. And there's a lot of research to show that that's so. Does that disprove the theory? Well, no, it doesn't, because if they already behave consistently with the theory would have nothing to tell them. So it's good that they don't behave ordinarily in that way, because we can say, no, what you're doing is wrong, do it this way, which seems to me to be an advantage. But there are some cognitive failures that make implementation of the theory tricky, and I'll talk about some of those. These two gentlemen, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, are famous for their work as experimental psychologists in investigating the way people make a whole range of judgments. Daniel got the Nobel Prize for his work. There he is getting it. Poor old Amos didn't. They worked together some of the time because he died, and apparently you can't get the Nobel Prize posthumously. So the only reason there was only one of them at the ceremony was that Tversky had died. If you want to read a readable account of particularly the work that Amos did, there's a book by Dan Gardner, who's a Canadian journalist, so it's quite a readable book about, it's called Risk, the Science and Politics of Fear, and it explains how politicians try to scare us in order to get us to vote for them. Tony Abbott said not so long ago, ISIS is coming to get us. Do you remember? So vote for me in the subtext, you know. So politicians, the media use fear, and this book, Penguin book by Daniel Kahneman, on thinking fast and slow. In that book, Kahneman says, anyone who believes in the expected utility hypothesis is deluded. So it seems I'm deluded. You can judge for yourself whether I am. The difference there, I think, is that he is talking about the hypothesis as a model of behavior, and I'm talking about it as a prescriptive model of choice. And so I think I can still use it as a prescriptive model. Also, Daniel gets a few things wrong, and I was thinking of writing a rejoinder, but I'm not sure I want to take on a Nobel laureate. So that's a wee bit tricky. This gentleman is Jack Knetsch, who's a mate of mine from Simon Fraser University. Many years ago, he came to the University of New England on a sabbatical and taught some courses for us. One day, Jack went up to the university shop and he bought some UNE mugs and also some bars of Toblerone chocolate. and he distributed the mugs and the chocolate more or less randomly amongst his class. So half of them got a mug, and half of them got a bar of chocolate. And then he said, who would like to swap their mug for chocolate? I have some more chocolate here. And about two-thirds to three-quarters of the students in the group said, no, we'll keep the mugs, thanks. Which is a bit odd because they were about the same price. And you might have thought that half of them would have preferred the chocolate since they were the same price. But no, two-thirds, three-quarters wanted to keep the mugs. So they then asked the ones who'd got the Toblerone whether they'd like to swap for a mug. Mugs seem to be more desirable than chocolate. And about two-thirds to three-quarters of them said, no, we'll keep the chocolate, thanks. So what's going on here? Well, the first thing you can say is you try and do a Hicksian indifference curve that represents that. It doesn't work. Which indifference curve you're on depends on where you start. It's called the endowment effect. We seem to value what we have more than what we haven't got. And maybe that's something that evolved through evolution, the human species, regarding what's ours. It was important. So, Hicksian demand theory has just been knocked over, and it seems that rational choice has just been knocked over. It's also called loss aversion. Now, have you noticed what's been happening to the stock market recently? Roughly speaking, people regard a loss as twice as serious as an equivalent gain, as this little graph shows here, right? So 2 up and 1 down, and the guy's panicking. So he had all that gain, and that one decline is regarded as bad as the benefit from the 2 increases. It's called loss aversion, and it's widely recognized as very common. Another way of thinking it is failure in asset integration. You don't think about changes in your wealth, losses and gains as changes in your wealth. This guy is Matthew Rabin, who thinks he's Einstein, I think. And I don't know how you pronounce this. This fellow is Thaler or Thaler. And these two did a series of experiments, Richard Thaler. Now, here we are. I've got a nice new 50-cent piece, and it's got heads on one side and not on the other, and I might give it to some honest person here to toss. And I'd like to offer you a risky prospect. If it comes down heads, I'll pay you $55. If it comes down tails, you pay me $50. All right? Is that clear? 50-50 chance of 55. Who would like to play? Put up your hand if you'd like to play. Come on. Why won't you play? The expected value of this is positive, right? Why aren't you playing? If you think about it, the way to get rich is to take any prospect with a positive expected value. Oh, if I offered you 100 tosses, or as many as you like, would you play? So why did you say no to the first one? I may say your response is exactly what nearly everybody does. Nobody wants to play. But it's nonsense. No, it's silly. You should be playing. If you were in business and you rejected every risky prospect that might have a loss, you'd be broke in a very short order, right? How many of you ever play poker machines or buy lottery tickets? Yeah, some of you do. They've got negative expected values. There you are. You're going out taking risky prospects that have got a negative expected value, and you won't take a positive expected value prospect. It's nonsense. I agree with you. So what you're doing is you're thinking about the loss, you're focusing on the chance of losing $50, and you're not thinking about it in relation to your wealth. Failure of integrating the losses and gains in the context of your wealth. Now, I don't know what your wealth is, but my wealth is not very much because I've nearly exhausted my human capital, because I'm shortly to be 80 years old. So what we've found out is that people are more risk averse for small bets than they are for larger ones, which doesn't make a lot of sense either. And it's failure in asset integration. Here's a utility function for wealth. Economists like to think that there's a utility function for wealth and there's diminishing marginal utility for wealth. You know, an extra dollar when you're rich is worth less than an extra dollar when you're poor. And it might look something like this. This is assuming a wealth of $2 million. If you think about the discounted value of your future earnings plus what you've got in the bank plus you take off your mortgage and so on, you might have around 2 million or 4 million or something. And here we are, we're going little moves up and down here. And the amount of risk aversion that's there is trivial for a 50-55 dollar bet. And what Rabin and Thaler showed is that there is no plausible utility for wealth that is consistent with the degree of risk aversion that you all just revealed. Right? So you're thinking about losses and gains in a different way from changes in your wealth. But paying me $50 or me paying you $55 is a change in your wealth, isn't it? So why did you think like that? So as I say, the best way to run your life if you want to get rich is to take all those risky prospects, to reject risky prospects like lotteries that have negative expected values, to choose risky prospects with positive expected values, except those that send you bankrupt or that would seriously reduce your chances of continuing business or continuing to prosper. And it seems to me the best way of handling that is in terms of my expected utility model. Now this comes from Daniel Kahneman. He says that why we get these things wrong, and lots of other judgments wrong, is we've got two thinking systems. He calls them System 1 and System 2, an affective and a deliberative one. System 1 works well most of the time. It's quick, and it uses all sorts of clues. So when you open the back door and you find a snake on the doorstep, you don't want to go and do a decision tree to decide what you're going to do. System 1 cuts in and says, ow, look, jump, look out, jump, you know, get back. System 2, he says, it can lead to some silly choices and bad consequences. And when it really matters, we need to invoke System 2, which is more thoughtful. Kahneman says that System 2 is lazy and inattentive most of the time. If I ask you what's 7 times 6, you know, if I ask you what's the square root of 37, you sort of think, oh, no, I'm not going to do that. You probably could work it out approximately if you had, you know, if you wanted to, but who cares, you know? So your System 2 doesn't cut in, it's lazy. So because of that, efforts to derive utility functions from decision makers often lead to inconsistent results. They're called usually framing bias. It depends how you ask the question. You know, ask a silly question, you get a silly answer. Ask the questions in different ways, you'll get different results, which is not very convincing. It is actually easier to get utility functions for wealth than it is for things like losses and gains. And if you ever get into this game, I do recommend you work with utility functions for wealth, because get people thinking about wealth, then and forgetting about losses and gains, then some of the problems that you've all demonstrated can be avoided. And then I think you've got to agree to, or assume, or insist on asset integration, because that will serve you best in the long run, you know, close to maximising expected returns without getting too anxious. Or you just can make a guess about the range of risk aversion and use risk efficiency methods, as I'll demonstrate, to at least separate risky prospects into the ones that are efficient and ones that are inefficient. Being a bit wrong about the degree of risk aversion seldom matters very much, in my experience, analysing several many risky choices. So one shouldn't perhaps get too paranoid about exactly how risk averse you are or other people are. Some ugly stuff about risk aversion. A lot of people get risk aversion wrong. One reason is that measures of risk aversion are tricky because the utility function is on an ordinal scale. It's like temperature. You scratch a 0 and you scratch a 100 or a 1, but there's no absolutes. So it's just an ordinal scale. Even Kahneman in his book gets that wrong. So it's easy to get wrong. Two common measures of risk aversion, absolute and relative risk aversions, are functions, not constants, though you'll find a lot of the literature treats them as constants. And it matters quite a lot what they are actually functions of, whether they're functions of wealth or of your permanent income in a Friedman sense, your long-run income, or of income next year, or of losses and gains today. You'll get quite different measures of risk aversion. An absolute risk aversion is measured in the inverse of the currency units. So you see papers in the Australian Journal of Agricultural Economics which say we've taken this range of risk aversion, absolute risk aversion, from a study of US farmers. Hang on, you can't do that. You certainly can't take risk aversion from America and apply it to Indian farmers, because the measures are in the inverse of the currency units. And a rupee is a quite different amount of money to a US dollar. Some of those papers have been published. And you also see wild levels of risk aversion used in agricultural economics sometimes. Well, if farmers were wildly risk averse, or if anyone else were, we would sit on our hands. We wouldn't be able to, because farming is a risky business. I worked in India at ICRISAT many years ago, and we could not detect any effect on the allocation of resources of most of the farmers due to risk aversion. Now, they've been there, those farming systems have been there for many, many years. They've evolved over millennia, and they're pretty well adapted to the environment, which is semi-arid, risky. Only for the smallest scale farmers could we find some evidence that they were being rather cautious because of risk aversion. And that's not a universal truth. Obviously, risk aversion does matter in some situations, but it's not as important as a lot of people think. I remember Michael Lipton wrote a paper many years ago implying that peasant farmers were, sort of locked into poverty through risk aversion. And the OECD has recently written a report which I tried to criticise, saying the same thing, that the small farmers are locked into poverty by their aversion to risk. I don't believe it. Now we'll have a short commercial break. This is the third and last edition of a book called Coping with Risk in Agriculture, written by these four people. The principal author's not going to do it again because he's got too old. And some of the things I'm telling you about today are in this book. The two things that are new about the third edition is that there's an explanation of the state contingent approach of Quiggin and Chambers, trying to demystify that, because I found all the algebra in that impossible in their book, and it took me a while to sort out what they meant. And we've also got a section that Gudbrand, my Norwegian colleague Gudbrand Line, wrote on the use of copulas. Have you heard about copulas? They're functions for joining together two or more marginal distributions. So it gives you much more flexibility in allowing for stochastic dependency than just using correlation. And most of the book was rewritten to some extent. This was, I don't have many good ideas these days, but this was an idea I had. This was a way of doing simple stochastic efficiency analysis. So on the bottom axis here we've got, these are different crop rotations for a farmer, and we've got a range from 0 to 0.006 in the value of the absolute risk aversion for this farmer or group of farmers. If you see numbers a lot bigger than that, I tend not to believe them. And what we do is simply calculate the certainty equivalent. That's the sum of money for sure that has the same, that would make the decision maker indifferent between facing the risk associated with these crop rotations or accepting the sure sum using some form of utility function, in this case the constant absolute risk aversion function. And you can see up the top there that up to about here, is it I? It's hard to see. I think I is the highest, and from there on, one of the little triangles, which is K, is the highest, and all the rest are below that for any risk aversion coefficient in the range. So we can say all those ones lower down are dominated. Farmer can forget those. All the farmer has to do is choose between the two at the top there. The values on this axis are the expected money values, no risk aversion, it's just the expected money values. And you can see that, I mean, it doesn't prove anything, but it doesn't really matter which of the two they choose, very much. And it's that sort of thing that makes me think that the probabilities are quite a good deal more important than the risk aversion. So there you are. Probabilities, I think, are much more important, because if you're working towards maximising expected value with some sort of reservations about bad outcomes, getting the expected value calculated correctly is really much more important than just tweaking it a bit for risk aversion, especially in capitalist agriculture or capitalist situations. I once interviewed the finance, many years ago, the finance director of Unilever, and asked him about risk aversion. He said, well, I'm an accountant, I'm extremely conservative, but when I'm making decisions for Unilever, we're a big firm and we maximise expected money value. I mean, you don't get to be the finance director of Unilever if you're stupid. And I thought that was very insightful that he already thought that through. So too much of the literature has been focused on risk aversion, and people inventing new utility functions and criticising old ones and so on, when really getting the probabilities right is much more important. Most failures in risk management are failures in imagination, assigning too high or too low probabilities to the ugly stuff happening. We tend to overestimate the risk of catastrophes. When system one think of a way in which something bad can happen, you assign too high a probability to it. Last time I gave this seminar, that was in the height of the Ebola outbreak, and there was a young man there who was absolutely determined that Australia was going to be wiped out by Ebola. And I was trying to tell him I didn't think so. I thought his chance of getting Ebola was about the same as being hit on the head with something falling out from outer space. And we just failed to agree. Most failures in risk management are failures in imagination. Here are some examples of cognitive failures. You see what they're doing wrong there? It's not a good place to be under a car and rather bendy boards. That's not the way to fix your air conditioner, really. Or to paint your window, I don't think. Not terribly secure step ladder. Nice and shady there, but and a window cleaner. This lower part is where he's standing up there where the circle is. And these people aren't wearing their seat belts. So, you know, we make silly decisions all the time. Two schools of thought about probability, the frequentist and the subjectivist. Most of you lot have been reared in the frequentist school. I'm a savage Bayesian. I follow Leonard Savage, and I'm a subjectivist. I think all probabilities are subjective in my head. The difference only matters really when relevant and reliable data are sparse or absent, which of course is usually the important decisions. No information. Catastrophes, by their very nature, they don't have a lot of history. There are not lots of times they've happened. So there's usually no data. For many important decisions, frequency data are not really relevant, they're sparse, or they're totally absent. Leads to some ugly consequences. Alan Greenspan was asked by a US Senate inquiry why things had gone wrong, and he said, nobody could have predicted the global financial crisis because nothing like it had happened in the last 20 to 25 years. Now, there's a couple of things wrong with that statement. First of all, 20 to 25 years is not a very big sample, and you would expect some outliers. Secondly, if he'd looked a bit further back, he would have noticed there had been quite a number of crashes over time. It was quite common. Thirdly, it's not a stationary stochastic process because somebody had changed the rules. They deregulated the finance market. And who should have known about that? A fellow called Alan Greenspan, because he was the one who had a large hand in the deregulation. So, you can see the way he was thinking. Risk is something that's measured by the variance, historical variance. But we're talking about the future. And he should have been able to turn around, now there's the past, turn around and look to the future and modify his thinking, recognizing that the world had changed. In agriculture, climate change, structural change, all kinds of change come along. And using historical data mindlessly, so many journal articles we use these data. No thought of whether, no consideration of whether those data are relevant to the future. Often, I've seen papers published in the American Journal and so on, using county-level data. Well, county-level variances are about 1/10 of what they are on farms or something. I mean, if you're trying to analyse individual farms, don't use county-level data. Use your brain. Think about it. You may have to make a guess. The other thing that's happened, ugly consequences, you see a lot of papers published for things which there are data because the students can do the historical analysis and calculate the variance, but not for the things that there are no data, which are usually more important. So I say using inappropriate data because that's all there are, like county data, and being either ignorant about or dishonest about the unsuitability of the historical data that you're basing it on, and using very small samples and not accounting for sampling bias. Usually distributions ought to be more spread out than a historical sample will indicate because the world is changing, your sample size might be small, and you're not sure whether the sample is relevant. You got it from farms from some other area, from where you're doing your analysis. So obviously they're not wholly applicable. And seldom are there any attempts to correct for bias. Look, there are no right or wrong probabilities. Only good and bad ones, only ones that have been thought about. Ex post, probabilities are either 0 or 1. Either it did happen or it didn't happen. The problem is you don't know which at the beginning, ex ante. So there are no right probabilities. And it's legitimate for different people to have different probabilities. It makes life very uncomfortable, but that's how it is, so get used to it. Good probabilities, to my mind, are well considered, consistent with the evidence and with one's whole network of beliefs, and honestly described and disclosed. Whereas if people are using subjective judgments in a paper, they'll tend to wallpaper it over to pretend that it's somehow objective when it's not. So it's time to be a bit more honest. And there's a lot known about cognitive favours, overconfidence in probability assessment, overconfidence, availability bias, group dysfunction and more. The best example of group dysfunction was the US Security Committee that ruled on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. If you put a group of people together in a room, there is evidence. I think there's probably, especially if they're men, but I don't know if there's any research on this. There is evidence that they will sometimes come up with a recommendation that is more extreme than any one of them would have agreed to individually. And a US Senate inquiry looked into why they got the weapons of mass destruction wrong and said it was group dysfunction. If you have a dog and it goes out at night and joins a pack, it'll go and kill sheep. nice, you know, really nice dog, always calm when you're there, but gets in a pack, it does stupid things. And I think humans are the same. Gangs of youths, you know, they do stupid things. You probably did, some of you probably did that when you were young. I know I did occasionally. So people in the group will act in a silly way, a stupid way, that you wouldn't do individually. So you don't put people in the group in a room and ask them to assess risks. You get them to do it independently. Sharing information is good, but making collective decisions is bad. And there's lots of research about that.
How does what you've just been saying relate to the sort of fashionable idea of the wisdom of the crowd?
Well, I think there's the social magnification of risk. The media beat things up, people beat things up. You know, there's this business about not vaccinating your children. But it's getting worse because people are scaring each other through social media. So I'm against it. I can't stop it, but I don't think it's a good idea. So there are some proven ways to do things better. Training in probabilities using proper scoring rules. Getting relevant knowledge shared using a nominal group without the dysfunction. Of course, using an irrelevant and reliable data. One reliable observation is infinitely better than 0. 1 divided by 0 is infinity, right? So one observation, if it's a good one, is good. And of course, more is better. One of the common things is neglect of prior probabilities. People tend to judge things by recent evidence rather than, if you like, the base rate. And if you get to think in terms of Bayesian analysis, you can avoid that. You can use Bayes' theorem if you like, but using calibration and feedback to improve with experience and disclose what you did. Don't hide it. So here's a question for you. What's your probability that the shortest route, the Great Circle distance, from Canberra to Singapore, that's the shortest flight, is less than 6,500 kilometres? Please don't look it up on your device. Pick a probability that that statement is true. If you're sure that it's less than 6,500 kilometres, you'll pick a probability of 1. If you're sure it's more, you'll pick a probability of 0. If you have really no idea, you'll say 0.5. Or if you have some tendency to think one way or the other, you'll pick a number somewhere in between. Can you think about that? Most of you probably flown to Singapore from somewhere in Australia, so you might have some sort of feeling about what it might be. So we write it down, and then in fact it's less. I think it's 6,300 and something. And this is a scoring rule here. So the blue curve applies if it's true, which it was, and the grey one if it had been false. If you picked a probability of 1, you're right at the top here. If you said 0, you're somewhere like minus infinity, and 0.5 is somewhere in between. If we did that for a whole series of almanac-type questions, you would learn to interrogate your uncertainty more reliably. You'd find you would get better at assessing probabilities. And it's a good idea to train assessors in that way. So summing up, we know a lot about how people fail to cope with risk. There's some good ideas of what to do better. Implementation has its problems, but surely is better than what happens now, at least for important risky choices. But nothing much is happening to get rid of the ugly and bring in the good, and I'm too old. So what we need, is, in my view, is a paradigm change in the way risky decisions are analysed and dealt with. We need some people to take their courage in both hands and adopt the SEU model. And all this self-deception and deliberate deception really ought to stop using historical data. And I say we need what Thomas Kuhn described in his book as a revolution. We need some young Turks to come along and rattle the cage and overthrow the old paradigm. So that's it. I just want to know what you're going to do in the graveyard. Anybody decided what you're going to do?
seems to me, in a sense, the first two shooters, well, actually there's missing information, so they just shoot in sequence, just one shot.
Yeah, they shoot in turn. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
I think
until only
both
one is
of the
left.
weaker people should shoot the one who's completely accurate, because the probability that the first two shots.
Your shot.
No, the first two shooters between them will have the probability as it's 2 over 9 of missing.
Yeah. So what are you going to do?
Whereas if they do both miss, then one of them is sure to get shot. So,
well, yeah. Well, there was a riot when Dylan pointed out the best thing you can do with the first shot is to shoot in the air and let the other two shoot it out, because the bad guy is going to aim at the ugly one. You've got 2/3 chance of killing him. If he misses him, the ugly one's going to shoot the bad guy dead. Then it's either way, it's your shot next. So by shooting in the air, you have a better prospect of surviving than by shooting either of the other two. And there was a lot of unhappiness over this. So I've finished. Comments and questions?
Do you think there are really very many genuine subjective Bayesians? There's certainly Bayesian statistical computation has now become very, very popular.
Yeah.
But almost everybody who uses that sort of methodology, I think, gives absolutely no thought to the prior distribution. Certainly not a meaningful subjective prior. They just choose the non-informed as something to get the computation.
You're right. We tend to ignore prior probabilities, what Kahneman says is the base rate. But if it was a really important decision, a policy decision or something like that, or a really important decision affecting your own life and circumstances, it'd be a good idea to find out something about, or think about what the base rate is. The availability bias means that recent events tend to loom large in our thinking and tend to dominate the way we make choices. And that's not really very smart. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that before you cross the road you calculate the prior probability to be run over by a truck. But when there are important decisions to be made, it's worth sitting down and thinking in that framework. I don't really do Bayesian analysis. I don't do the sums, as it were. But I do try and think about how likely this sort of thing is to happen. And I mean, take the vaccination of children. I mean, how many children die because of vaccination before we start getting too excited? Because we read of one in the paper.
Yeah.
You know, this child got ill after being vaccinated. Whether it's because of the vaccination, we're not sure. So, no, we're not going to have kids vaccinated. It's not a sensible way of making a choice like that.
Prevalent thing is mixing up the anecdotal things.
It's called availability bias. After the September 11 Twin Towers, many thousands of Americans started driving long distances rather than flying. Because obviously, large aeroplanes can fly into tall buildings. We've seen it on television 1,000 times. There were more people killed the increase in road deaths was more than the number of people killed in the Twin Towers, the spike in road deaths. It didn't last long because availability bias fades away incredibly quickly. But during the time, they weren't thinking straight about the risks of travelling. I mean, even today, it's safer, certainly far safer per kilometre to fly than it is to drive, and it's somewhat safer per hour to fly rather than drive. But they ignored those things, and we all got in their cars and drove off. And if they thought about the base rate of the number of road accidents, they might have gotten an aeroplane and wouldn't be dead. So, yeah, you need to think in that framework. Similarly, you know, I take maximum excess on insurance policies generally, because the principle of insurance is I pay them more than they pay me, and I can afford. I had a windscreen break the other day. I was cross, but I had to pay for it. But it was $200 and something. It didn't send me broke. And it's cheaper to insure over the years. I'm hoping I won't have too many midstream break, and I'll be in front. So it's just a matter of rationalising. Someone else? Yeah.
So sometimes, or a lot of times, government have to respond to some crisis, and they have a short period of time to respond. Sometimes 1 week, and there wouldn't be enough time to do a research to assess the risks associated with different decisions. So what they do, I heard that they sit around the table with 5 specialists and they decide. So would that attract some mistakes? And also, I was wondering, is it the best that they make the decision before they go to the meeting, or what's that?
Well, you'd expect group dysfunction. I mean, you'd expect it for 2 reasons, of course. First of all, because they might make some irrational choices because of group dysfunction. And also, they have a different objective function from the rest of us. They want to get re-elected if they're politicians, and we want, we want the socially optimal choice to be made. We recently, our local council hired a risk consultant to come and do a study of environmental risks in the council area. And what he did was he called a series of meetings, people who knew about weather, from the council largely, of different groups. And I was horrified. I mean, they got so much wrong. It wasn't a good way to do it. I mean, one of the things he said was there was no risk of people dying from electrical causes. A man was killed just outside my office when a truck touched the overhead cables, and 2 roofers had died in Armadale because they had extension cords with an adapter, and it pulled out and just touched the roof, electrified the roofs. So they didn't take any account of some prior evidence. One was a council employee who was the guy who was electrocuted. And people get together and they say, oh, no. The only thing that could go wrong in electricity is it might go off and then the emergency department at the hospital might be affected. But they got generators, so that's all right. Oh, come on, think about it. They obviously didn't think clearly.
It's also because they don't have a specialist on this issue.
Yeah, it could be, yeah. But I would, if you have a nominal group, a nominal group means you choose people who know about who are knowledgeable about the area, but not from necessarily the same perspective. You do a Venn diagram. You want to expand the knowledge base by getting people in with different perspectives. But you don't stick them in a room. Well, you can do it in a room, but you ask them to make their probability assessments individually and secretly, not share them. Or you do a Delphi.
But they share the meeting, isn't it?
Yeah. They share. You can. Sorry, I've used meetings, and I think that's worked quite well. But don't ask for the probabilities, because the social pressures to conform can be bad. And if the big boss is there, might want to agree with her or him. Not a good way to do things. Black hair. I'm sorry, I am a little deaf. Can you speak up?
Just wondering, given many choice of measuring risk aversion, you can see if the farmers, for example, are risk averse from the choice of disease crops, or the other way is that you do experimental with monetary incentive, and the other way when you look at the characteristic of the person, assuming that some characteristic like education or even gender.
You could do. I was in India when Hans Binswanger did a series of experiments, some with real money, with Indian farmers, trying to elicit utility functions, and I spent some time analysing those data. And that's one of the reasons why I said the smaller the payoffs, the more risk-averse the results. I mean, basically you can't do that. Well, I know it's being done, but basically I think the results are nonsense. From trying to elicit with small, we imagine. In Indonesia we had huge problems because in presenting risky prospects to Muslims, and the Quran says you mustn't gamble. So getting probabilities from Hindu farmers about their crop yield is very difficult, because in the Hindu religion you've got a lot of gods, some of them are nasty, and if you make predictions about what your crop's going to yield, then God's might come and get you. So, you know, there's all sorts of cultural and other problems in eliciting these sorts of probabilities. That's why I emphasize efficiency analysis, efficiency analysis, rather than trying to measure probabilities exactly. Getting probability estimates from behavior might be okay, but the problem is that if your model is imperfect, the imperfections of your model tend to get put into the measure of risk aversion, depending on how you do it. And so you may tend to overestimate how risk averse they are. I mean, I'm sorry, it's really hard. But I don't believe that many people in the world, even quite poor farmers, are paranoid about risk. They live with it all the time. In India, they multiple crop. They had 2 crops, you know, different rows. They had safety net strategies, such as send someone off to work as a labourer in the city, so they had some income coming in from there. And they evolved strategies of this kind. If you were really paranoid, you become an academic, not a businessman.
One of the problems, Brian, you talked about 25 years guide for the Reserve Bank.
Yeah.
It's one of the problems that we don't look back far enough.
Well, Greenspan didn't.
No, but I mean, is that one of the problems in determining the retrofit of a probability? We don't then normalise it to the conditions.
Yeah, well, I think there's two problems. We tend to. I mean, there's a problem looking back too far because the world was different. But you may still learn from history. So it's good. You know, there was the tulip crash and there was the South Sea bubble, and if he'd looked back, as well as the 30s crash, of course, if he'd looked back, he would have seen that there have been crashes in the past, and I'm sure there'll be more in the future if we're not having one now. So in that sense, it was silly to only take 20 to 25 years. But the other thing you have to do is to do the turnaround, as I say. So there's all the history. Gee, we've learned a lot about that. And if you can understand some cause and effect things going on there, that's good. But now you've got to turn around and look into the future. And what annoys me is people just saying, this is what the variance has been, so this is what we're going to do. I mean, the banks were in a terrible state because they were all using value at risk, which was a variance-based measure of risk. And it wasn't relevant anymore. They got massive data sets because of the data logging, so they had very confident estimates of the variance, statistically confident, nice lots of stars. But the world suddenly changed. The stars didn't do them any good because the world had suddenly changed after the GFC. So it's that psychological readjustment of looking into the future, and you're looking into a crystal ball. And what you really ought to be saying is, I'm much more uncertain about the future than I was confident about the past. You can be moderately confident about the past if you've got good data, but you can't be very confident about the future. So you need more dispersed distributions when you're looking into the future.
And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for excellent presentation.